All right. First analogy. Principle of permanence of substance. In all change of appearances, substance is permanent. Its quantum in nature is neither increased nor diminished. So essentially, my understanding is in the analogies, Kant wants to show the relationship of time and how that exists, just how time functions in reality. And the first one is effectively, as he just kind of said, one way time functions is, or we can see that time functions, is the consistency of substance progressing through time. And that's what he's going to talk about here. Proof. All appearances are in time, and in it alone, as substratum, as permanent form of inner intuition, can simultaneity as well as succession be represented. Time, therefore, in which all change of appearances is to be thought, endures and does not change. For time is that in which, and as determinations of which, simultaneity and succession alone can be represented. Right? As time by itself cannot be perceived, apparently he says that a lot, it follows that the substratum, which represents time in general, and in which all chains or simultaneity can be perceived in apprehension through the relation of appearances to it, must be found in the objects of perception, that is, in the appearances. Okay, so the way that we see that time is continuing is not through, observing or experiencing time, because time isn't perceivable, but rather through the consistency and or change of substance within time. Okay, now the substratum of all that is real, that is, of all that belongs to the existence of things, is substance. And all that belongs to existence can be thought only as a determination of it. Consequently, the permanent, in relation to which alone all temporal relations of appearances can be determined, the permanent, in relation to which alone all temporal relations of appearances can be determined, is the substance in appearance, that is, the real in appearances, that as the substratum of all chains remains always the same. Okay, I think he's saying the same thing, but in a fucked up way. As therefore, substance cannot change in existence, its quantum in nature can also neither be increased nor diminished. Our apprehension of the manifold of appearance is always successive, and therefore always changing. By it alone, therefore, we can never determine whether this manifold, as an object of experience, is simultaneous or successive, unless there is something in it which exists always, that is, something constant and permanent, of which all change and simultaneity are nothing but so many kinds, parentheses, modes, of time, in which the permanent exists. All relations of time are therefore possible only in the permanent, simultaneity and succession being the only relations in time. Sorry, what? All relations of time are therefore possible only in the permanent, simultaneity and succession being the only relations in time, so that the permanent is the substratum of the empirical representation of time itself, and in it alone all determination of time is possible. Okay. And that's substance. The substratum is effectively substance, right? Permanence expresses time in general as the constant correlate of all existence of appearances. of all change and concomitance. For change does not affect time itself, but only appearances in time. Makes sense. Nor is simultaneity a mode of time itself, because in it no parts can be simultaneous, but all are successive. If we were to ascribe a sequential succession to time itself, we would have to think another time in which such succession could be possible. Right, effectively, like, if you are thinking, I think what he means is, like, if you think of time as, like, continuing after time, then it implies that there's two times, one before and one after. If you think of it in, like, time actually being in succession, but there's only one time, so that doesn't really make a lot of sense. Only through the permanent does the sequential existence in different parts of a series of time assume a magnitude. Right, there needs to be, like, something fixed within time, substance, in order for you to, in order for us to effectively experience time in the way that we do. Okay, only through the permanent, and he's calling it like 5 different, like permanent, substratum, substance, but it kind of feels like he's referring to similar concepts, at least. I'm sure there are nuances that I don't understand. Only through the permanent does sequential existence in different parts of a series of time assume a magnitude, which we call duration. For in mere succession, existence is always coming and going, and never has the slightest magnitude. Without this permanent, therefore, there is no relation of time. Time in itself, however, cannot be perceived, and it is therefore the permanent in appearances that forms the substratum of all determination of time, and is at the same time the condition of all possibility of all synthetic unity of perceptions. Okay, that is the possibility of experience. Kind of already talked about that. Would make sense. While with regard to that permanent, all existence and all change in time can only be taken as a mode of the existence of what is permanent and constant. While with regard to that permanent, all existence and all change in time can only be taken as a mode of the existence of what is permanent and constant. In all appearances, therefore, the permanent is the object itself, that is, the substance, while all that changes or can change belongs only to the mode in which substance or substances exist, and therefore to their determinations. Okay, let me read that again. In all appearances, therefore, the permanent is the object itself, right? That is, the substance, while all that changes or can change belongs only to the mode in which substance or substances exist, and therefore to their determinations. That kind of makes sense, right? Like, I don't know, you have, ice, and that is the substance which allows us to experience time. It changing to water is not, it necessarily being affected by time, but it is some mode that allows it to change, and we perceive it through time, if that makes sense. Or because of time, maybe. I find that in all ages, not only the philosopher, but also the man of common understanding, have presupposed this permanence as a substratum of all change of appearances. It will be the same in the future, except that a philosopher generally expresses himself somewhat more determinately, by saying that in all alterations in the world, substance remains constant, and only the accidents change. But nowhere do I find even the attempt to prove this very synthetic proposition. Indeed, it is very seldom placed where it ought to be, at the head of the laws of nature, which are pure and entirely a priori. Okay, so Kant thinks this is a priori. Okay. I kind of get it. I think he's just like saying, he's kind of saying he's saying the same thing, but viewing it differently. Meaning, I think most people agree that, I don't know, the ice cube example, there is substance within that demonstrates to us time, but other philosophers think it's synthetic, meaning, it's something that we kind of, don't necessarily, well, synthetic isn't necessarily, it could be a priori and synthetic, is kind of my big hang up here. Because if you said a posteriori, I'd be like, okay, they think we have to experience it and see it, and that's how we know that the ice cube exists in time, because we see it changing. But Kant is effectively saying, we know this a priori. We have substance within the world, and time is also an a priori concept. Rather, an a priori intuition. And, it is eventually filled with substance. And we know we effectively experience time through the continuity of this substance. And we often witness changes with this, but it's not synthetic. Why wouldn't it be synthetic a priori, I guess? It certainly wouldn't be analytic a priori, right? Anyway. In fact, the proposition that substance is permanent is tautological, because that permanence is our only ground for applying the category of substance to appearance. And it ought first to have been proved that in all appearances there is something permanent, while the changeable is only a determination of its existence. Okay, so one of the definitions of substances are that they are permanent. They might change, but that's based on their existence, what he said. But I would say conditions, whether they change, but their status as a substance wouldn't change. It is permanent. Okay. But such a proof can never be given dogmatically, that is, from concepts, because it concerns a synthetic a priori proposition. Okay, which is... I wish you would explain that a little more. Maybe you will. And as no one ever thought that such propositions could be valid only in reference to possible experience, and could therefore be proved only by a deduction of the possibility of experience, we need not be surprised that, though this proposition served as the foundation of all experience, because in empirical knowledge one feels the need for it, it has never been established by proof. Okay. A philosopher was asked, okay, this is where Professor Gijsbers says Kant gets into some weird territory where it starts to become empirical, because he implies the idea of the permanence, I forget the correct term for it, but the permanence of substance, if you burn something, it all just changes into a different element, but it is consistently, measurable as the same weight. But anyway, which is kind of an empirical concept as opposed to an a priori concept, because we don't know that that's true before experience. A philosopher was asked, how much does smoke weigh? He replied, subtract the weight of the wood burnt, the weight of the remaining ashes, and you have the weight of the smoke. He therefore presupposed, as undeniable, that even the fire matter, substance, does not perish, but that its form only suffers an alteration. Similarly, the proposition that nothing comes out of nothing was only another conclusion from the same principle of permanence. Or rather, that the everlasting existence of the subject proper in the appearances. For if that in the appearance, which people call substance, is to be the substratum proper of all determination of time, then all existence in the past as well as the future must be determinable by it, and only in it. Okay. Thus we can give to an appearance the name of substance only because we presuppose the existence of substance at all times. This existence at all times is not even fully expressed by the word permanence, because it refers more to future time. The inner necessity, however, to be permanent is inseparably connected with the necessity to have always been, and the expression may therefore stand. Yeah, God, more Latin. Fucking 55. Okay, footnote 55. In the Transcendental Doctrine of Elements. I don't know, it's about a bunch of nothings. If there's nothing from nothing, then nothing can possibly exist. Something like that. Let's see how good my just fake Latin guessing is. Nothing can come from nothing. Nothing can go back to nothing. Okay. Were two propositions that the ancients never separated, but which nowadays are sometimes separated due to a misunderstanding, because people imagine that they concern things in themselves, and that the former might contradict the dependence of the world on a supreme cause, even with regard to its substance. This apprehension is entirely needless, because we are only speaking here of appearances in the sphere of experience. Lest we forget. Okay, and I think I mean I don't know. Is it kind of what he's getting at? The idea of the smoke and the fire, the weight of smoke, I should say, kind of smacks of things in itself, meaning like very definable qualities as they are, as they exist, kind of, and are measurable. Whereas I think he's talking it more like a, I don't know, metaphysical level, that like there is permanent substance which fills the world. It's not necessarily, in the same form or the same weight or the same substance at all times, but we a priori know we have to have substance within the world, and that is the way in which we experience time, through the permanence of some substance which populates the world. It being the same is not saying that it is like, even if one thing changes into the other, it remains kind of the same thing except for transmogrified in some way. That wasn't a word, but is it mogrified, transmogrified? I don't know. Anyway, but he's making a more basic point that like the world is populated with substance. That substance is permanent, and that permanence, like from one moment to the next, is what allows us to experience time and informs our a priori understanding of time through substance. Okay. This apprehension is entirely needless, because we are only speaking here of appearances in the sphere of experience. And the unity of experience would never be possible if we allowed that new things... This one kind of makes sense to me. I remember new things, new in substance, could ever arise. Effectively, like, I think the point he's making here is like, if new substances or new things could enter the timeline, in effect, it would be like inserting something from outside the timeline into the timeline, which would be kind of creating a new timeline, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. So kind of all of the substance within the timeline has to be self-contained in some way, or else there would have to be something outside of it that you could add to it, I guess is a different way of putting it that makes maybe more sense. So that doesn't really make sense to, I think that's kind of the way in which he is cabining the possibility of substance in the fact that, like, smoke plus ash plus the remaining wood is ash, or like wood minus remaining ash, remaining wood equals the weight of the smoke. He's just kind of talking about the single timeline and the permanence of substance, as opposed to like this theory of, substance always remaining kind of the same, if that makes sense. For in that case, we should lose that which alone can represent the unity in time, namely the identity of the substratum, in which alone all change retains thoroughgoing unity. This permanence, however, is nothing but the manner in which we represent the existence of things in appearance. The determinations of a substance, which are nothing but particular modes in which it exists, are called accidents. Right, like what happens to the substance are called accidents, okay? They are always real because they concern the existence of the substance. Negations are nothing but determinations which express the non-existence of something in the substance. Right, okay. Would, like, ice melting be an example of that? It's like, okay, whatever. Doesn't matter. If we want to ascribe a particular kind of existence to this real in substance, as for instance to motion, as an accident of matter, when we call it inherence, in order to distinguish it from the existence of substance, we call it subsistence. Okay, when we want to, like, ascribe a property effectively to a substance, then we call it inherence. In order to distinguish it from the existence of the substance, which doesn't actually necessarily have those properties. Okay, which we call subsistence. This, however, has given rise to many misunderstandings, and we shall express ourselves better and more correctly if we describe the accident only as the manner in which the existence of a substance is positively determined. Okay. It is inevitable, however, owing to the conditions of the logical use of our understanding, to separate, as it were, what can change in the existence of a substance, while the substance itself remains, and to consider it in its relation to that which is truly permanent and radical. Hence, a place has been assigned to this category under the title of relations, not so much because it itself contains relation, as because it contains their condition. Okay. On this permanence depends also the correct understanding of the concept of alteration. To arise and to perish are not alterations of that which arises or passes away. Alteration is a mode of existence which follows another mode of existence of the same object. Okay. Meaning, like, yeah, okay. It is, yeah, I think that explains itself. I just had to think about it for a second. Hence, whatever alters remains, and only its state changes. As this change concerns only the determinations which may have an end or a beginning, we may use an expression that seems somewhat paradoxical and say, only what is permanent, substance, is altered. What can be transformed does not itself suffer any alteration, but only a change, because certain determinations cease and others begin. It is therefore only in substances that alteration can be perceived. Arising or perishing, taken absolutely, and not referring merely to a determination of the permanent, can never be a possible perception. Right, meaning like the non-existence of, or coming into existence of substance can't be possible for probably the timeline reasons we talked about. But for it is this permanence which renders possible the representation of a transition from one state to another. That also makes sense, because if it wasn't permanent, it wouldn't be something changing from one thing to another. It would be a new thing coming into being, which doesn't make sense. For it is this permanent which renders possible the representation of a transition from one state to another, from not being to being, and consequently these can be known empirically only as changing determinations of what is permanent. If you suppose that something absolutely begins to be, you must have a point in time in which it is not. But to what can you connect this point in time, if not to that which already exists? Right, and this is kind of what we're talking about, the timeline issue. A preceding empty time cannot be an object of perception. But if you connect this arising with things which already existed and continue to exist up to that which arises, then the latter is only a determination of the former, as of the permanent. The same holds good with regard to perishing, for this presupposes the empirical representation of a time in which an appearance no longer exists. Okay? Substances, in appearance, are the substrata of all determinations of time. Yes. If some substances could arise and others perish, the only condition of the empirical unity of time would be removed. Okay? Makes sense? It starts to scare me when stuff makes too much sense to me. And appearances would then refer to two different times in which existence would flow side by side, which is absurd. For there is but one time in which all different times must be placed, not as simultaneous, but as successive. Permanence, therefore, is a necessary condition under which alone appearances can be determined as things or objects in a possible experience. Permanence, therefore, is a necessary condition under which alone appearances can be determined as things or objects in a possible experience. What the empirical criterion of this necessary permanence, and with it the substantiality of appearances may be, is something we shall have to explain in what follows. Alright, we got through the first analogy. I believe the first analogy deals with substance. I believe the second analogy, it deals with cause and effect. So this is a kind of a shorter passage, but yeah, we'll get to the second analogy next time.